welcome on board the Rich Planet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On the 21st of February, I went to Wandsworth Prison to visit Muad'Dib, also known as Anthony John Hill. As of today, the 4th of March 2011, he has spent over 140 days in prison and has not been convicted of anything. Muad'Dib lives in Ireland and in 2007 produced a very compelling film called 7/7 Ripple Effect. The film casts huge doubt on the official story of the 7/7 London bombings of 2005 and shows quite clearly that the alleged suicide bombers were probably innocent and most likely set up by intelligence services to take part in a mock terrorist training exercise by playing the role of suicide bombers. Incidentally, several other films have also been produced casting massive doubt over the official story. None of these films have been shown on mainstream television. A terrorist drill was taking place at the exact locations and the same times where the supposed suicide bombs were detonated. The evidence points to a false flag terrorist attack organized by the authorities who planned the terrorist drill. Yes, you heard that right, folks. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. Let's just say that again for anyone who didn't quite catch it. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. And one more time for luck. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. The evidence which supports this statement is abundant, which is why the authorities have dodged an inquest into what actually happened on 7/7. The current investigation into 7/7 is not an inquest into what happened, and is not an inquest into whether the alleged bombers were guilty. It is a complete smokescreen, where certain evidence is not being allowed into the court, such as the clearly doctored single frame of CCTV footage put out by the authorities to try and place the alleged terrorists at Luton train station at a particular time. The alleged terrorists were not even on the tube trains when they blew up. Do 10 minutes of research and you will find that at least 2 of the alleged bombers were murdered by police marksmen near Canary Wharf because they missed the train at Luton and were late for the mock terrorist training exercise they had agreed to take part in. I hear you saying, but the BBC have been covering the inquest and have put out information about the events in their news. There is no doubt these men were on the trains. Let me clarify this point. The BBC has put out lies, lies, and more lies about the 7/7 bombings. For those of you still clinging to the notion that Islamic terrorists perpetrated this act, here's a little factoid for you to chew on while watering your pot plants. At the current so-called 7/7 inquest, the authorities have not provided any clearly recognizable CCTV footage of any of the alleged terrorists at King's Cross or any other tube station, platform, walkway, or on the tube trains themselves on the day of 7/7 before the explosions occurred. Let's just repeat that so it sinks in. The authorities have not provided any clearly recognizable CCTV footage of any of the alleged terrorists at King's Cross or at any other tube station, platform, walkway, or on the tubes themselves on the day of 7/7 before the tube explosions occurred. Now, there's quite a simple explanation for this, and we're having a little competition to ask viewers what the explanation might be. Is the reason A, all CCTV cameras on all the relevant tube trains, platforms, escalators and walkways weren't working? B, the alleged terrorists were not at King's Cross until after the explosions? Or C, life is an illusion and we are all manifestations of our own consciousness and the world doesn't actually exist? Answers on a postcard to the Rich Planet starship. Do you think we were born yesterday? Who are you trying to kid? P.O. Box, slap my thigh with a large banana. The winner will receive a Starship bullshit annunciator so that you can press it whenever the BBC news comes on. Now, you might be sitting thinking, no, I did see a CCTV picture of one of those guys at a tube station. I'm sure the BBC showed it. 3 years after the bombings, a very dubious, unclear CCTV sequence was produced at the Kingston trial, which the BBC have used repeatedly. The sequence does not show any faces and is considered by some to have been fabricated and timestamps added. Now, some of the alleged bombers went on a trip to London 1 month before 7/7 and visited the London Eye. They were caught on CCTV at that time, shown here on this recognisable CCTV image. Compare this with the only CCTV sequence of the alleged bombers on the morning of 7/7 at King's Cross before the bombs went off. If these men were actually there would be multiple instances on many different cameras, including images on the tube trains of the men's faces, similar to this image, but there are none. In 2008, the authorities were trying to convict 3 innocent men for helping these alleged terrorists. In that trial, known as the Kingston trial, the judge directed the jury, stating the original 4 bombers were guilty. This is in fact not true, and by stating this, the judge was attempting to pervert the course of justice. The alleged 7/7 bombers have never been found guilty of anything and under our law are currently innocent. Because of the judge's misdirection of the jury, Muad'Dib thought that the evidence presented in his compelling film should be considered by the Kingston trial. So he sent some copies of his DVD to the court for the attention of the judge and for the jury foreman to suggest considering this evidence. This is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, to send evidence to a trial for consideration. The evidence sent on DVD was not considered in this case. Nevertheless, because of this act, Muad'Dib was arrested in Ireland under a European arrest warrant for attempting to pervert the course of justice, when in fact he was attempting to prevent the perversion of the course of justice. He was extradited by the Supreme Court of Ireland on the 11th of November 2010 and is now in Wandsworth Prison awaiting trial in the UK. He has spent over 140 days in prison and has not been convicted of anything, and all he did was send his DVD to a court, which they ignored. His trial date is set for the 8th of May 2011, and he has applied for bail several times. On 2 occasions since January this year, bail hearings have been arranged, but the prison on both occasions did not present Muad'Dib to the court for the bail hearing, so he is still in prison. I spoke to Muad'Dib in Ireland in November 2010, the day before he was extradited to London.
Everybody was asking for an independent public inquiry into the bombings to find out what really did happen. The relatives of the deceased and the injured and the survivors themselves, many of whom were injured. There were something like 800 people injured. Yeah. And these people all want a public inquiry. Yeah. So I thought that by sending my film to the court, okay, to the people who were in charge of trying these people, if I was to send the information to the court to point out to them that they are misleading the jury, okay, in regards to the 4 original bombers at the very least, that would then get my film and the evidence into the court system, into the judiciary, and that then they would have to investigate and they would have to have a public inquiry, an independent public inquiry, which is what everybody wanted.
Yes. I went to Wandsworth Prison to visit Muad'Dib on the 21st of February 2011. Right, I'm standing outside Wandsworth Prison and we've just spent 3/4 of an hour visiting Muad'Dib, who is being held in here. He hasn't been convicted of anything. He's been in for well over 100 days or spent well over 100 days in a prison cell, and he was in very good spirits. He told us that he's no longer being kept for 23 hours in a cell. He's actually got a job in the computer department cleaning. He told us that he was going to be challenging the Crown's jurisdiction over him, that that was going to be the first part of his defence. Now, he also told us a few things. He said that we asked, was he sharing a cell? He said he was. There was 2 people to a cell in bunk beds, and he said that he'd been in sharing cells with different people, and the person that he was currently sharing with, they have a television in the room, so he is able to watch the news. However, the person he's sharing with watches all the junk TV, so he watches Coronation Street and all the soaps, and he rarely gets a chance to see the news, but he occasionally does. So he seemed in very high spirits, quite incredible considering the circumstances. He explained to us that he's had 2 bail requests now, and the court has arranged to hear his bail requests twice, and both times the prison has failed to transport Madib to the court for his bail request to be heard, and this has happened twice, which I think is very, very unusual, and I think they're just putting it down to administrative errors. So it appears that they're trying to keep him in here for as long as they can. For whatever reason, they're trying to string this out as long as they can, which is preposterous when you consider what he actually did. He sent a DVD to a court to be considered as evidence, and he spent, I think it's over 130 days inside now, and he's been convicted of nothing. So let's just hope he gets a jury, a fair jury, which will come to the conclusion that he was not trying to pervert the course of justice, he was trying to tell the truth. Now, a few weeks ago I interviewed Barry Chauhan, and Barry made some very interesting claims about a conversation he had with a Turkish professor called Professor Berk Ustandar. Now, here's a clip just to remind you of what was said.
And we were just having a general discussion, and out of the blue he said he flicked on his computer projector and threw up an image onto a wall, a circular window, and he said, "Do you know what this is?" And sort of caught me unawares a little. I'm not really a scientist, but I'm fairly adept and have a lot of knowledge and articulate enough to gauge things. And I said, it looks like a very sophisticated circuitry for a chip, because I've worked with some companies like ARM and other chip companies around the world, and in our own area we had 2 very good companies, Fujitsu and Siemens at one time, manufacturing chips. So I said, it looks a very complicated circuit, and he said, yeah, it is. It's 10,000 years old. Right. And I stopped in my tracks, and I said, did you just say 10,000-year-old a chip? That's 10,000. I said, where is it? Where's it from? And he said, it's all around us. It's in the air. And I didn't quite understand what he was on about. And he basically was referring to the fact that there's all sorts of frequencies around us. Right. And I don't know if they're correct, whether it's ether or atmosphere or whatever. And he said, we've got it from there. And I said, but how do you know it's 10,000 years old? And he implied, without saying, that it was from a craft. Right. And the discussion obviously stopped in my mind.
So why do you think he showed you it then?
I mean, well,
let's just say that this had come out of a recovered alien or ancient craft. Why would he show it to you?
I think the next question is pertinent to what he said to me. He said, do you know what Vimanas are? That's V-I-M-A-N-A-S, Vimanas. The Hindus have a series of religious books and texts which are called the Rig Veda. They have 2 other books which are called the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which is more recent times. The Sanskrit of the original goes back many thousands of years. And in there is a whole section dealing with Vimanas, which were flying machines. Even to the point where, within the holy text, they describe how you can build them.
Now, after this show aired, I was contacted by Professor Berk Ustandar because he clearly got wind of the show, and I'm going to read out in full the email that Professor Ustandar sent me. I think Mr. Chauhan has an interesting way of understanding that tries to combine different subjects, but this way yields only confusion and is not acceptable. For example, my expertise is on forecast, system identification, control systems, instrumentation and pattern recognition. When we use remote sensing facilities, and if we have some additional security, as in the similar to several other projects and financial systems, it never means that we work on something hidden. We disseminate our research results at scientific platforms, e.g. journals and events, and in official reports. None of our projects is related to extraterrestrial technology. We do not use telescopes, we only have scientific and governmental telemetry sensor networks and remote sensing satellite image downlink and processing capabilities. I personally respect the paranormal science, but the projects we work on are not related to paranormal investigations. We only use scientific methodologies within known technological approaches. I personally believe that if there is something called paranormal, then we have to be sure that it is repetitive under observation conditions, because any creation must obey rules of physics in nature. Only the difference is some rare observations, sometimes called paranormal, lets us modify our knowledge on physics and we develop our theories. This is a continuous process and serendipities are a part of that. As a result, what we do and deal with are irrelevant to extraterrestrial technologies or paranormal activities. I'm sure you know the best way and most polite way of correction of this situation. Kind regards, Professor Berk Ustangdar, Istanbul Technical University. Seems fair enough. Now, the reply is quite robust, but it nicely avoided some of the claims made by Barry Chauhan. Specifically, did the professor show Chauhan a diagram of a circuit, and if so, what was the circuit of? And secondly, did the professor discuss Vimanas with Barry Chauhan? Now, I've been contacted by Barry Chauhan and he sticks by everything that he said. So I thought I would reply to the professor and ask him to clarify these points. I did get a reply from Professor Ustangdar and he reiterated that they don't have any project or mission related to UFOs or extraterrestrial technology. Now, he also said that Barry Chauhan asked him if he was interested in philosophy and history, and Professor Ustangdar replied to him that yes, but only on subjects related to possible ancient technologies and the engineering history. You know, due to obsessions caused by our existing approaches, sometimes we miss some other solutions used in the history. That is limited by a personal interest and there is no connection to our work. And he also says in his email, since he was originally an Indian, I asked him if he has some printed articles or reprints, including Vimanas and some other ancient Sanskrit legacies. Later on, Chauhan gave Professor Ustangdar a book. So it seems Professor Ustangdar did discuss Vimanas with Barry Chauhan, albeit on a personal basis, nothing to do with the university's work. Incidentally, Professor Ustangdar has very kindly invited me to have a look around Istanbul Technical University. A few weeks ago, I had a chance to speak with the biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Now, Rupert has researched many areas of biology, in particular those relating to the mind, and asks the question, do our minds extend beyond our brains? And this leads to more questions about whether telepathy exists and also whereabouts our long-term memories are stored, because some people believe long-term memory is stored outside of the brain. After the break, I'll be screening the interview with Rupert Sheldrake, and also in part 3, Rupert is wanting people to take part in his telepathy experiment, which is free of charge, so stay tuned for that also in part 3. Today I'm very pleased to be able to speak to Rupert Sheldrake. Now, Rupert is one of the world's most innovative biologists and writers. He is best known for his theory on morphic fields and morphic resonance, which leads to a vision of a living, developing universe with its own inherent memory. And Rupert, you started your educational life at Cambridge University,
Yes.
Is that right? And can you tell us a little bit about what you studied at Cambridge and a brief summary of what you then went on to do?
I studied biology at Cambridge. and I was interested in how plants and animals grow and develop. So I spent 10 years at Cambridge doing research on plants, how plants grow. And most people don't realize that there's a big problem at the heart of biology, how things take up their form. Because a plant or an animal starts from a fertilized egg, which hasn't got much shape. I mean, it's a round ball with things inside the cell, but nothing like as complex as you or me or an oak tree. And so the question is, how does all that complexity, how does that form appear? The usual theory is that it's just genetically programmed. That's what most people would just say, is genetically programmed. But it turns out the genetic program is a very vague concept that doesn't really explain anything. What the genes do is code for proteins, and they enable the organism to make the right proteins, the right chemicals. But how they're assembled, how they're put together, isn't understood.
Right.
And within biology, there's the idea that that's organized by something called a morphogenetic field, which means a field that shapes form. Morpho means form, genetic means coming into being.
Right.
And these fields are like invisible blueprints of developing organisms. It's like the architect's plan for a building, which is invisible. I mean, the plan can be written on a bit of paper, but the architect could just have it in his mind. The proteins are part of the chemicals the organism's made of, like the building materials. And you can't have a building just with building materials. You have to have a plan. So these fields are like plans. Now, they're part of a larger category of fields called morphic fields, concerned with form or shape. And morphic fields organize the activity of brains. They organize the behavior of flocks of birds or colonies of bees or termites or ants. They link together social groups. So there's a whole class of fields in nature, I'm suggesting.
Right.
And these fields have a shape which depends on a memory. That's where morphic resonance comes in. Similar things influence subsequent similar things. So everything has an inbuilt collective memory.
Right.
Every species has its own memory. So if you train rats to learn a new trick in London, because of morphic resonance, rats all over the world will be able to learn the same thing quicker.
Right.
That's what I'm saying, that there's a
Quicker,
organizing principle in nature that enables things to happen quicker or easier after they've already happened. It's like a principle of habit in nature.
Okay. Now, that field itself then, I mean, from a physics point of view, electromagnetic waves are waves in the vacuum of space. So I'm of the mind, space is not nothing. It is a medium through which waves can push against.
Yes.
Now, is the morphic phenomenon that you're talking about, is it using space in the same way that electromagnetic waves push space as they travel as waves, or is it something else?
Well, it's in space. It's a field that gives spatial form or pattern. So it's a field that is to do with patterns and forms in space.
Right.
In that sense, it's in space. Now, the thing is that space is a tricky concept in modern physics. I mean, it's not just the ordinary three-dimensional space that we experience in daily life. Morphic fields are very like quantum fields, which are part of quantum theory. And quantum fields are in multi-dimensional spaces. I mean, physicists talk in terms of extra dimensions of space. And their mathematical models have lots of extra dimensions. The thing is, we can't conceive of these extra dimensions. So they come cheap in modern physics. They can just invoke them whenever they want. So the thing is, the known fields of physics, quantum fields, are in multi-dimensional space. Superstring theory says all fields are ultimately in a 10-dimensional space. So morphic fields, no doubt, are in spaces a bit like that, but it's none of them, even the ordinary fields of physics, are in straightforward three-dimensional space.
Okay, so it's in a dimension which isn't in our three dimensions, the morphic field.
I mean, exactly. That would really be if you model it mathematically.
All right.
But as the simpler way of thinking about them is the morphic fields in and around what it organizes, like a magnetic fields in and around a magnet. the magnetic field's inside the magnet, but it stretches out around the magnet as well. The Earth's gravitational field's in the Earth, but it stretches out round the Earth. That's why it holds the Moon in orbit. Now, the morphic field of an oak tree is inside the oak tree and around it. Now, the bit that isn't, that's local in the sense it's in a place. But when the oak tree tunes into the memory of previous oak trees, the process of morphic resonance goes across space and across time.
Right.
Now, that may travel through extra dimensions, or it may go into some other kind of realm and then come back into this one. David Bohm, the physicist, called it an implicate order. So that you can model it in different ways. None of them are easy to understand, any more than regular modern physics is easy to understand. But the key point is the fields are within and around what they organize, and they have a memory from previous similar systems.
All right. Now, one of the statements that you use, which seemed to sort of rang true with me, if you like, was that do minds reach out from brains, which is kind of what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yes.
I've done a little bit of reading on where things are stored in the brain, and nobody seems to really have a clue how long-term memory works.
That's true.
And I think that I don't believe that long-term memory is stored in the physical grey matter of our neurons, in our neural networks.
Nor do I.
So the brain is, for long-term memory at least, is an interfacing device.
Yes. Well, what I'm saying is that personally, I think brains are overrated. I think people assume that all the memories are stored inside the head, and they think that all our minds are confined to the inside of our head. And I don't think that's true. I think the brain's more like a tuning device, a bit more like a TV set or a mobile phone that tunes into influences coming from elsewhere. I think the memories are things that we resonate with. I think we have a collective memory. We tune into lots of other people in the past. But we tune into ourselves as well by the same kind of process, only we tune into ourselves more specifically because we're more similar to ourselves in the past than anyone else. That's why we get our own memories, not other people's. And so I think the brain's like a tuning system. The memories are not stored inside the brain. We resonate with ourselves in the past. When you go to a familiar place or meet a familiar person, when your nerve cells stimulate your eyes and senses stimulate the brain cells, they resonate with the same kinds of patterns when you saw that person before, and you remember it all by resonance. So the memory is not inside the brain, according to this theory.
All right. And does that describe what you would term the akashic record, or is that another complete theory altogether? Because people say that.
Yes. Well, the Akashic record is an attempt to get at the same kind of idea. You see, in the 19th century, theosophists who were English people interested in Eastern philosophy, most of them were English, and they were out in India, they read up on Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. And in Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, there's the idea there's a kind of memory in nature. It's more or less what I'm saying. And they came up with the idea, the theosophists, of the Akashic records. Akash is the Indian word for space or ether. And so they had the idea that these records in space of what's happened in the past. I'm saying something very similar. There's a cosmic memory, the laws of nature are more like habits. But you see, the Akashic record uses a metaphor that I wouldn't use. Record implies something like a filing cabinet or a CD or a tape recording or something. The word record, because we think of it in terms of books or filing systems, implies some physical store somewhere in space. Now, I don't think that's how it works. I think it works by resonance across time. And you can resonate, if you remember what you did yesterday, you resonate with yourself yesterday. But in between yesterday and today, it's not as if all that information has been stored in a static form somewhere outside space and time in a cosmic filing cabinet or something, or a cosmic hard drive. It's a direct resonance across time. So the idea of Akashic records is basically saying the same thing as a cosmic memory, but it's using a metaphor that I don't think is appropriate. I use a different one, resonance.
Right. And if I'd like to ask you about your work studying animals. For example, dog owners whose dog seems to think that they're coming home before they're anywhere near, and people who can wake their dog up by looking at their dog.
Yes.
I mean, the other thing that you also quote on your website is that experiments need to be blind or double blind.
Yes.
So for example, if you were going to try and prove that owners can wake up their dog by looking at it, how would you conduct a test in a blind or double blind situation with that?
Well, the thing is that blind or double blind, in this case what you use is a randomized trial. There's some tests you can do blind. That's when you don't know what. A blind test means, say you were doing an experiment and you were testing two compounds, A and B.
Yeah.
If they're enzymes in biochemistry, if somebody says, okay, if it's not blind, they say, well, this is the ordinary enzyme and this is the inhibited enzyme. And if you know what to expect, you tend to see what you want to see. This applies to regular science. That's why people use blind methods. Now, in some circumstances, you can't stare at a dog when it's asleep blind. I mean, you know you're staring at it, so you can't possibly stare at it when you don't know you're staring at it. So the method you have to use there is a randomized method. You see, if you stare at a dog and you can wake it up by staring at it, what the skeptics will say is, oh, well, how do you know it wouldn't have woken up anyway? Or maybe you've made some noise that's made it wake up and stuff. So what you have to do is have a series of randomized times. You could stare at it any one of 10 different times during a space of an hour. And then somebody else at random picks a number from 1 to 10 and says, okay, you're going to stare at it in period 7, not in periods 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if what happens is that you don't make any noise, ideally you'd look through a window. You'd have the dog behind a soundproof barrier. Now, most homes don't have those, but you'd have to do it in the same room to start with, but you'd make no noise. You just, in that period, you stare at it. You videotape the dog all the time. If it wakes up during period 7, but not in other ones, then that would suggest something's happening. And if it could be a coincidence if you just do it once, but if you do it over and over again with different random timings, then you get the idea that the stare is actually waking the dog rather than it just being a coincidence.
Because there are dog owners who will tell you this.
There certainly are, yes. Quite a lot of people say they can wake dogs or cats by staring at them. This is a rather good research project. You see, the slogan for it is "Don't let sleeping dogs lie." Stare at them. So the reason I'm doing this research is because I'm interested in the way the mind extends beyond the brain. And this is something that happens to humans. If you stare at a human being from behind, if you stare at another person, they don't know you're there, they can often feel it and they turn round. And that's what I call the sense of being stared at.
And you think that in animals' evolutionary process where they're preyed on, they are other animals are trying to kill them, then it would be useful to know if you're being stared at by a predator.
Absolutely,
and that's possibly where that phenomenon is developed, perhaps.
Yes, I think that's where it's come from, because, you see, I think our minds stretch out beyond our brains. So, if I'm looking at something, say I'm looking at a dog, I don't think there's a sort of little cartoon-like dog inside my head. I think my image of the dog is projected out through my eyes to where the dog is. I have a kind of dog image in my mind, but that's projected to where it is. So my mind touches what I'm looking at. And that's why dogs or people can feel when they're being looked at. And I think all animals have vision that works like that. And I think in the course of evolution, if prey animals were able to become sensitive to when predators were looking at them, they'd escape better. So I think it's something pretty basic in animal nature, and the reason humans have it, and more than 90% of people have said they've had this experience, it's very common. The reason we have it is simply it's part of our animal nature. And it's useful, and people who are in dangerous situations, you know, people in the army and stuff pay attention to this, and so do detectives and surveillance officers. They're trained to know that if you're watching somebody, if you're following somebody as a private detective, you don't stare at their back while you're following them, because they're likely to feel you, turn around and catch your eye, and your cover's blown. You look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them, but it's better to look at their feet.
Right.
And in the martial arts, people are trained how to become more sensitive to being stared at from behind.
Why not join me, Richard D. Hall, live for an evening on board the Starship at the Oaken Gates Theatre in Telford, 11th of May 2011. In the show, I'll be addressing many of the areas I've covered over the past year, including false flag terrorism, UFOs, animal mutilation, the financial crisis, and more. Learn what your government isn't telling you and what your media isn't allowed to tell you. Tickets are available now from the Oaken Gates Theatre website. Further future venues include Weston-super-Mare, Leeds, Barnsley and Newcastle upon Tyne, with further venues to be arranged. Find more details on the richplanet.net website. Now, there's a particular parrot I would like to ask you about. So you did quite a bit of research with this parrot that had, I mean, tell me about it.
Well, a lot of animals can pick up their owner's intentions, and I described this in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And some of the most sensitive animals turn out to be African grey parrots.
Right.
And I've been working with one in the United States that's not only sensitive to its owner's thoughts and intentions, but because it's got a big vocabulary, it can actually speak.
Yeah.
And so it actually says what she's thinking.
Really?
It sleeps in her bedroom, and it sometimes wakes her up from her dreams by commenting loudly on her dreams.
Really?
So I did some controlled experiments where we had a series of photographs corresponding to words the parrot knows.
Yeah.
She sat in one room. The photos were in sealed envelopes, randomized. So she'd open an envelope. She didn't know in advance what was in it. It might be a picture of a car. And the parrot in another room was being filmed. And the question was, would it say car or flower or whatever she was looking at? And the answer is yes, it did. And it did much more than you'd expect by chance. So this is this series of experiments showed that this parrot was indeed telepathic and could pick up and actually say in English what its owner was looking at.
So if we just mention the skeptics, because I know you obviously in this field you have your share of them.
Oh yes.
I mean, what would they have you published a paper on this parrot research?
Oh yes, yes. It's published. All my stuff's published in peer-reviewed journals. So normal science involves skepticism. So when you publish them, you have referees who read them and they check to see if there's any faults in the statistics and stuff. So they've all been vetted.
Yeah.
But there are a whole group of deniers out there, so-called skeptics, who are actually dogmatic believers in materialism, who think that psychic phenomena are impossible.
Right.
Now, those kinds of skeptics are not open to evidence, in my experience. For example, when I did this parrot research, I published it, and there was a TV program about it on Discovery Channel.
Right.
And they wanted to get a comment from a skeptic, because in the media they always ask a media skeptic to comment. And they got Professor Lewis Wolpert, who's a biologist at University College London. And they rang him up and they said, Rupert Sheldrake's done this research and he says this parrot's psychic. And Wolpert just said, oh, it must be nonsense. And they said, would you like to look at the videotape of the experiment to comment? He said, oh, I don't need to see the evidence. So I know it's rubbish. And then he just appeared on TV and said, there's absolutely no evidence that telepathy exists in any animal or person or thing. It's completely impossible. And so the point is that kind of skepticism comes very cheap. I mean, he didn't need to bother to look at the facts. He doesn't need to concern himself with the evidence. He knows what he thinks. His mind's made up. Well, I challenged him to a public debate at the Royal Society of Arts. There was a judge in the chair. And it turned out he knew absolutely nothing about this field, and he didn't feel he needed to because he was so sure it was impossible. Now, that kind of skepticism is what I encounter all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have somebody who says, I've looked at your data and maybe there was a mistake here and the statistics aren't right here and you could have designed the experiment better here. That's fine. That's normal science, and I'm used to that as every scientist is used to that.
Yeah.
But there's this kind of denialist skepticism which simply won't look at the evidence, and that I don't think of as real skepticism at all. It's a kind of dogmatic belief system.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Now, I've actually, there's just something I'd want to share with you, because I was very intrigued by the fact that your long-term memory may well be somewhere outside of your neural network, shall we say. And let me just explain this to you. Your short-term memory, they say, is in your frontal lobe. You know, if you're making a cup of tea, you remember where you've put the teacup. And your habit type memory, so to remember how you drive a car, is I think in the cerebellum. So these are fairly well understood. But your long-term memory, where you're remembering, say, things from your childhood, they say that there's the part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is used in formulating those long-term memories.
Yes.
But they somehow end up somewhere else in the brain, but no one seems to know how they get from this hippocampus to elsewhere in the brain.
Yes.
Now, I thought, well, possibly the hippocampus is pushing out the memory into some other space or some other dimension, and that the rest of the brain is then a receiver to that at some other point in time. Now, I then looked into what research had been done on this thing called the hippocampus, and over the last 5 years, scientists have done quite a lot of research into rat hippocampus.
Yes.
Now, what they've found is that certain cells inside the rat hippocampus are called grid cells, and the reason why they call them that, if they put a little device on the cell to measure its electrical activity, and they just let the rat wander around a room, it basically they will get an increase in voltage at certain points in space, and what it does is it maps out this grid. So if it was to walk around the room for several hours, the grid cells are triggered at these points, and it maps out a perfect hexagonal triangular grid system.
Yes.
Now, what the scientists say is the reason why the purpose for that is for its navigation to get from A to B. Now I think you see your navigation is done by another part of the brain. I can't remember what it is, but it's not necessarily the hippocampus. And there was this guy called Henry Mollison, and he had both his hippocampus removed, and they were non-functioning, and he didn't lose any of his spatial awareness. Okay, so you would by this argument you would say, well, he should have lost all of his spatial awareness. Now, but what this guy did, he lost his ability to create long-term memory, so he couldn't remember what he'd done a week ago. Okay, because his hippocampus wasn't formulating those memories.
Yes.
But he could remember what he did 5 years ago because his hippocampus was working at that point in time, you see.
Yes.
Because it had formulated the memory. So the other thing about the hippocampus is, I'm an electrical engineer, it's packed full of zinc. And zinc is the only metal which has negative resistance. So you can actually make a radio transmitter out of a piece of zinc. So I'm thinking that this grid is actually the mechanism that it's using to tap into the space. You know what I mean? That these are maybe access points to where the memory is being stored, perhaps. And but every science paper that I read, this is to do with spatial awareness, this grid. So I just wanted to...
Oh yes, well, I know, I've been tracking this literature too. I think what my reading of it was this, that in order to build up a memory, you've got to associate things together. What you recall is what the associations you've made at the time. If you don't make them in the first place, you can't recall them. So like when you meet a new person, most English people are hopeless at remembering names. They're introduced to somebody and they instantly forget. Now Americans are different. You know, if you meet if I meet somebody in America, they say, "Hi, Rupert." Well, "How are you today, Rupert?" They keep repeating it, so they get it. And next time you meet them, they can remember your name. It's very impressive. Now the thing is, you have to create the associations to remember them. Now, what happens? The hippocampus has a kind of spatial map in it, and when you encounter something in a particular place, there's an activity in the hippocampus that links it to the sights and smells and things, all the other aspects of that thing. They all get linked together, and the hippocampus seems to be the place that links them together to create this resonant pattern inside the brain. It's a kind of resonant pattern of activity. Now, what happens then is that they've mapped all that, they've shown it happens and stuff, brain scientists. But after you've had that experience, you move on to some other experience. The hippocampus are creating other resonant patterns. And the first one isn't in the hippocampus anymore. So then they assume it must have been shunted off into some other part of the brain for long-term storage, which they can't find, as you rightly say. They can't find it there. I don't think it's there at all. I think it works by resonance. The hippocampus sets up a resonant pattern that links things together in a kind of spatial way. And then when you remember it, you tune into that. Now, if people lose their hippocampus, then they can't set up these new resonant patterns like this chap you mentioned. And in experiments with rats, they've found you can train rats to learn new mazes and where things are. And they need the hippocampus for that. But you can cut the hippocampus out after that, and they can still remember, which is why they say, well, the memory must be somewhere else. Well, it is somewhere else. It's not in the brain at all, in my view, rather than being in some undefined other bit of the brain.
And are there, I've heard of stories of people having an entire hemisphere removed, and they can remember almost everything. Is that?
Yes. Well, I mean, the point is that's happened in experiments with rats. In the 30s and 40s, people were desperately trying to trace memories in the brain, and they trained rats to learn new tricks, and then cut out various bits of the brain, the right, the left, the front, the back, and stuff. And they found that when the rat had recovered from the operation, it could still remember, even after big chunks of the brain had been removed. And that's why they came to the conclusion that, as they said, memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular, because you couldn't pin it down in a particular place. And some people said, well, it must be stored holographically in the brain. A hologram is where you have a kind of photo interference pattern in a photo. Even if you cut half of a hologram off, you can still get back the same image. Each bit contains information from the whole.
Right.
So I don't think it's holographic, because that's still the theory, it's stored in the brain, but they're trying to explain the fact you can't pin it down. I'd go further. I'd say it's not in the brain at all, which is why you can't locate the exact memory stores.
And if this is the case, then, you know, you then have this, you just philosophically speaking, what would happen if you connected to the wrong person? You connected to someone else's brain memory, so there must be some kind of umbilical cord keeping us all connected to our own memories. Do you see? I mean,
well, I think that's similarity. You see, the umbilical cord I don't think is an actual cord. I think it's the fact you're more similar to you yesterday and last year and when you were a child than you are to me. That's why you have your own memories, because you resonate with yourself.
Right.
Now, if you had serious brain damage, an accident that disrupted your brain and changed the way it resonates, you might conceivably pick up other people's memories. And there are cases of people who have accidents who have extraordinary abilities they didn't have beforehand. I read a case just yesterday where somebody had a major accident to the brain. They were unconscious, and when they came round, they could speak fluent Italian, whereas before the brain injury, they only had a very sketchy knowledge of the language.
Really?
And I would think that what was happening there, they were somehow resonating with Italian speakers, that it had sort of changed the normal tuning. I mean, it's as if you always watch, say, Channel 4 on TV, and then you drop the TV, it has an accident, and from there on it's stuck on BBC One.
Yeah.
You can't get Channel 4 anymore.
Yeah.
It would be something like that. But so I think normally we tune into ourselves, but accidents could possibly alter the tuning to some degree.
So just give us your website address, Rupert, and the books that you've written.
My website's www.sheldrake.org, Sheldrake. My book on animals, Unexplained Powers, is called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. My book on the unexplained human abilities, telepathy, premonitions, and the sense of being stared at, is called The Sense of Being Stared At.
Okay.
And my book on memory in nature, morphic resonance is called A New Science of Life.
Okay. All right. Is there anything you want to add, Rupert?
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing. I've just launched a new experiment on telephone telepathy. This is one of the things I do research on. A lot of people have the experience of thinking of someone who then rings. They say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you.
Yeah.
About 80% of people have had that experience. Now, I've been doing experiments on telephone telepathy for the last 5 or 6 years, and they show that this is real. It's not just coincidence and people forgetting all the times they're wrong. Right. Something's really going on. I've just launched a new automated test on telephone telepathy, which works on mobile phones.
Right.
And so I'd like to mention that because anyone who's viewing this in the UK or in the US can do that test. It only works in the UK and the US at the moment.
Right.
To do it, you go to my website, www.sheldrake.org, go to the online experiments portal, go to the mobile telephone telepathy test. You put in the names of 2 friends or family members who've got mobile phones and their phone numbers, and the computer picks one of them at random, sends them a text message and asks them to ring you. You then get a phone call from the computer that says, one of your 2 callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you.
Right.
Please guess who it is by pressing 1 or 2 on your keypad. Right. So you guess who it is. Then the line opens up and you can speak to them. So you find out instantly if you're right or wrong. And then after a minute it cuts off because I'm paying for the call.
All right.
and after a random time delay, it does the same thing again. So you do 6 of these trials.
Right.
It takes less than an hour.
Right.
So it's fun to do. It's free. I mean, of course, you have to pay for the mobile phone calls, but they're only to landlines.
Right.
And it's on my website, and anyone can do this. So I'd invite anyone who's at all interested in these things to try the experiment for themselves.
Right. And when do you envisage publishing the results from that, Rupert?
Well, it depends. I want to get at least 1,000 trials before I do that. So it rather depends on getting enough volunteers to do the test. So
well,
this
should help. This should help.
This should help.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Thanks for speaking to me today,
Pleasure.
Rupert. Short, but absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On the 21st of February, I went to Wandsworth Prison to visit Muad'Dib, also known as Anthony John Hill. As of today, the 4th of March 2011, he has spent over 140 days in prison and has not been convicted of anything. Muad'Dib lives in Ireland and in 2007 produced a very compelling film called 7/7 Ripple Effect. The film casts huge doubt on the official story of the 7/7 London bombings of 2005 and shows quite clearly that the alleged suicide bombers were probably innocent and most likely set up by intelligence services to take part in a mock terrorist training exercise by playing the role of suicide bombers. Incidentally, several other films have also been produced casting massive doubt over the official story. None of these films have been shown on mainstream television. A terrorist drill was taking place at the exact locations and the same times where the supposed suicide bombs were detonated. The evidence points to a false flag terrorist attack organized by the authorities who planned the terrorist drill. Yes, you heard that right, folks. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. Let's just say that again for anyone who didn't quite catch it. Actually there would be multiple instances on many different cameras, including images on the tube trains of the men's faces, similar to this image, but there are none. In 2008, the authorities were trying to convict 3 innocent men for helping these alleged terrorists. In that trial, known as the Kingston trial, the judge directed the jury, stating the original 4 bombers were guilty. This is in fact not true, and by stating this, the judge was attempting to pervert the course of justice. The alleged 7/7 bombers have never been found guilty of anything and under our law are currently innocent. Because of the judge's misdirection of the jury, Muad'Dib thought that the evidence presented in his compelling film should be considered by the Kingston trial. So he sent some copies of his DVD to the court for the attention of the judge and for the jury foreman to suggest considering this evidence. This is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, to send evidence to a trial for consideration. The evidence sent on DVD was not considered in this case. Nevertheless, because of this act, Muad'Dib was arrested in Ireland under a European arrest warrant for attempting to pervert the course of justice, when in fact he was attempting to prevent the perversion of the course of justice. He was extradited by the Supreme Court of Ireland on the 11th of November 2010 and is now in Wandsworth Prison awaiting trial in the UK. He has spent over 140 days in prison and has not been convicted of anything, and all he did was send his DVD to a court, which they ignored. His trial date is set for the 8th of May 2011, and he has applied for bail several times. On 2 occasions since January this year, bail hearings have been arranged, but the prison on both occasions did not present Muad'Dib to the court for the bail hearing. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. And one more time for luck. Our own intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, are perpetrating acts of terrorism and murdering their own people. The evidence which supports this statement is abundant, which is why the authorities have dodged an inquest into what actually happened on 7/7. The current investigation into 7/7 is not an inquest into what happened, and is not an inquest into whether the alleged bombers were guilty. It is a complete smokescreen, where certain evidence is not being allowed into the court, such as the clearly doctored single frame of CCTV footage put out by the authorities to try and place the alleged terrorists at Luton train station at a particular time. The alleged terrorists were not even on the tube trains when they blew up. Do 10 minutes of research and you will find that at least 2 of the alleged bombers were murdered by police marksmen near Canary Wharf because they missed the train at Luton and were late for the mock terrorist training exercise they had agreed to take part in. I hear you saying, but the BBC have been covering the inquest and have put out information about the events in their news. There is no doubt these men were on the trains. Let me clarify this point. The BBC has put out lies, lies, and more lies about the 7/7 bombings. For those of you still clinging to the notion that Islamic terrorists perpetrated this act, here's a little factoid for you to chew on while watering your pot plants. At the current so-called 7/7 inquest, the authorities have not provided any clearly recognisable CCTV footage of any of the alleged terrorists at King's Cross or any other tube station, platform, walkway, or on the tube trains themselves on the day of, so he is still in prison. I spoke to Muad'Dib in Ireland in November 2010, the day before he was extradited to London.
Everybody was asking for an independent public inquiry into the bombings to find out what really did happen. The relatives of the deceased and the injured and the survivors themselves, many of whom were injured. There were something like 800 people injured.
Yeah.
And these people all want a public inquiry. Yeah. So I thought that by sending my film to the court, okay, to the people who were in charge of trying these people, if I was to send the information to the court to point out to them that they are misleading the jury, okay, in regards to the 4 original bombers at the very least, that would then get my film and the evidence into the court system, into the judiciary, and that then they would have to investigate, and they would have to have a public inquiry, an independent public inquiry, which is what everybody wanted.
Yes. I went to Wandsworth Prison to visit Muad'Dib on the 21st of February 2011. Right, I'm standing outside Wandsworth Prison, and we've just spent 3/4 of an hour visiting Muad'Dib, who is being held in here. He hasn't been convicted of anything. He's been in for well over 100 days or spent well over 100 days in a prison cell, and he was in very good spirits. He told us that he's no longer being kept for 23 hours in a cell. He's actually got a job in the computer department cleaning. He told us that he was going to be challenging the Crown's jurisdiction over him, that that was going to be the first part of his defence. Now, he also told us a few things. He said that we asked, was he sharing a cell? He said he was. There was 2 people to a cell in bunk 77 before the explosions occurred. Let's just repeat that so it sinks in. The authorities have not provided any clearly recognisable CCTV footage of any of the alleged terrorists at King's Cross or at any other tube station, platform, walkway, or on the tubes themselves on the day of 7/7 before the tube explosions occurred. Now, there's quite a simple explanation for this, and we're having a little competition to ask viewers what the explanation might be. Is the reason A, all CCTV cameras on all the relevant tube trains, platforms, escalators and walkways weren't working? B, the alleged terrorists were not at King's Cross until after the explosions? Or C, life is an illusion and we are all manifestations of our own consciousness and the world doesn't actually exist? Answers on a postcard to the RichPlanet Starship, Do You Think We Were Born Yesterday? Who Are You Trying to Kid? P.O. Box, Slap My Thigh with a Large Banana. The winner will receive a Starship bullshit annunciator so that you can press it whenever the BBC News comes on. Now, you might be sitting thinking, no, I did see a CCTV picture of one of those guys at a tube station. I'm sure the BBC showed it. 3 years after the bombings, a very dubious, unclear CCTV sequence was produced at the Kingston trial, which the BBC have used repeatedly. The sequence does not show any faces and is considered by some to have been fabricated and timestamps added. Now, some of the alleged bombers went on a trip to London 1 month before 7/7 and visited the London Eye. They were caught on CCTV at that time, shown here on this recognisable CCTV image. Compare this with the only CCTV sequence of the alleged bombers on the morning of 7/7 at King's Cross before the bombs went off. If these men were